Today I would like to present my research on the conflict of intention versus reception, an analysis of the reception of two controversial American operas, Dead Men Walking and The Death of Klinghoffer. In the world of opera composition, there has been a move to create more politically minded pieces, in that the subject matter of the opera will deal with ideological concepts that have roots in national or international political decisions. Two such recent works are John Adams' The Death of Klinghoffer and Jake Heggie's Dead Men Walking. The first work deals with the well-known Achille Lauro hijacking of 1985, and the second with a nun's experience with a Louisiana death row convict. Both of these topics are politically charged and involve very complex emotions and opinions, and both operas were met with very different reactions. Klinghoffer received a high amount of negative criticism for its treatment of Jewish characters and its supposed glorification of the Palestinian hijackers. Dead Men Walking, on the other hand, was greeted with open arms and proclamations that it must be reckoned something of a masterpiece, a gripping, enormously skillful marriage of words and music to tell a story of love, suffering, and spiritual redemption. In this paper, drawing on musical analysis, current research, and extensive evaluation of operatic performance reviews, I will argue that despite the true intentions of all involved in the creative process of these two operas, the reception of these two controversial works was determined by the dramatic construction of their respective libretti and scores. The root of the story behind Dead Men Walking lies in the personal life experiences of Sister Helen Prejean, a Roman Catholic nun from Louisiana. In the mid-1980s, she received her first invitation to converse with someone on death row and would later accompany him to his death in the electric chair. She has since become an activist who speaks out against capital punishment and founded an organization called Survive, which offers counseling to families who are victims of violence. In 1993, she published a non-fiction book entitled Dead Men Walking, outlining her experiences with death row inmates. It would be turned into a highly successful film in 1995 and later transformed into an opera by American playwright Terrence McNally and young American composer Jake Heggie. Jake Heggie is an American composer of primarily vocal music, operas, art song, etc. His career has been pioneered by such great American singers like Frederica von Stade, Renee Fleming, and Joyce DiDonato. With a musical palette influenced by such composers as Vaughan Williams, Debussy, Poulenc, Barber, Bernstein, Porter, Gershwin, and Coward, it can be seen that his natural affinity is to set music for the human voice. Heggie was working for San Francisco Opera as their public relations associate when he was approached in 1997 to collaborate with Terrence McNally on a new opera for San Francisco's 2000-2001 season. When they finally had a chance to determine their subject for the opera, McNally suggested Dead Men Walking, and immediately Heggie agreed. McNally later presented Heggie with a 2-act play based on the film and Sister Helen's book, and gave Heggie permission to use as much or as little of the material as he wanted. The opera that resulted from his collaboration premiered on October 7, 2000 at the War Memorial Opera House in San Francisco. Before the world premiere of Dead Men Walking in 2000, Linda Schaller from PBS station KQED began putting together a documentary titled And Then One Night, The Making of Dead Men Walking. This documentary closely examined the creative process of making the opera and also the stories of families impacted by someone on death row. Many of the interviews that were conducted deal with what the creative team and the singers were trying to convey with this new work. Prejean was asked about the stance the opera takes regarding the death penalty. She answered by explaining, quote, "A true work of art is one that brings people to a deeper level of reflection. True art, I think, brings you both sides of a conflict. Then people go into their own hearts to search it out." End quote. She was asked what she hoped the audience would get out of the opera and responded with a simple, quote, "To go to a deeper place in ourselves." End quote. Susan Graham, who portrayed Sister Helen on stage, described how careful everyone was being in telling the story. She said it was important to everyone that the story not be about the death penalty, but instead about, quote, "love and redemption and forgiveness," end quote. Composer Heggie explained that the goal they wanted to achieve with this opera was not to produce a documentary, not to recreate the movie, or to create the life story of Sister Helen or any of the other characters, and it was certainly not going to be a place for anyone to get on their soapbox to promote a political agenda. This opera was to be, quote, about human beings on an amazing journey and people from rather ordinary circumstances thrown into an extraordinary circumstance, dealing with the most incredible conflict and the most intense pain, and how we make it through that pain, and how the hardest journey that any of us takes in our lives is forgiveness, end quote. This is what I believe sets this work apart from many other operas that try to deal with politically charged subjects. The intention of the creative team seems pure, not littered with political agenda or any implication of what is right or wrong. No one character's feelings are presented as more justified or better understood. Upon inspection of the libretto, you can see that the story is presented in its most simple and raw form. You see the sides of the families whose relatives were killed and their support for the death penalty. You also see Joseph Desrochers' mother, who adamantly opposes the death penalty and refuses to even listen to the possibility that her son may have committed murder. Lastly, there is Sister Helen, positioned perfectly in the middle ground, a nun on her own spiritual journey, dealing with her own moral dilemmas, who serves as a mirror for the audience to see how they might deal with these issues. The opera opens with the shocking scene of the murder of 2 teenagers. By the time the scene concludes, nothing has been left to the imagination of the audience. The murderers' identities were not concealed, and before we officially meet Joseph Desrochers, we know of his guilt. The idea of opening the opera with the only real action of the opera might strike someone as strange, but I think this was an effort of the librettist and composer to keep the story natural. It never leaves reality and tends to focus on the hard facts of the lives of these characters. The audience is not spared from any portion of the story, from the raping and killing of the teenage girl to the death by lethal injection of Joseph Desrochers. The librettist Terence McNally is a playwright who had never been commissioned to write an opera libretto before. When he was asked to participate in this project, he was straightforward, explaining, quote, "If you're looking for someone to write a poetic libretto, I'm the wrong guy," end quote. He stated in an interview that he wrote the libretto as a 2-act play in contemporary vernacular American English because individuals in this kind of emotional situation would not be speaking poetically. Consequently, McNally was highly praised by critics and audiences for his natural dialogue in Dead Men Walking. Lofty Mansouri, the general director at San Francisco, promoted Jake Heggie from working in the publicity to being the company's first composer in residence. Already a gifted art song composer, his extraordinary ability to set words to music allowed him to keep the naturalism set up by McNally. Upon hearing the score for the first time, it was, and is my opinion, that the words were never overshadowed by the music. Heggie was very smart at times to leave the music out entirely, to let the spoken text slice through the tense air. For example, in the final scene where Rocher is walking to the execution chair, rather than having a dramatic musical moment filled with soaring high notes, the words "Dead Man Walking" were spoken into silence, followed by a chorus of the Lord's Prayer. Following the walk, Rocher delivers his last words, which are sung on a middle C, and in the productions I listened to, they were delivered in a non-emotional, monotone style. Silence and simplicity are techniques that Heggie aptly applies to much of the opera. The first moment of true lyricism does not happen until Sister Helen's car scene about 25 minutes into the opera. This is the same moment that the audience is first introduced to the internal conflict that will plague Sister Helen and the other characters through the length of the entire opera. In the score, we can see repeated fluctuating figures reminiscent of the ticking of clock hands, which returns whenever Prejean is vocalizing her struggle with this journey that she is on, and is referred to by Heggie as the Joseph theme. Her journey aria comes to a conclusion when she reaches the prison, and its sweeping vocal lines are heard several times throughout the rest of the opera whenever she returns to her internal conflict of right and wrong. Now we will listen to a section of the journey aria from Act 1 of Dead Men Walking. Frederica von Stade said this in 2010 about the success of Dead Men Walking. It's never not hit home, you know? I think that resonates so much because it's such a dramatic topic in our day and it relates so much to our day, end quote. Since its premiere in 2000, the opera has been performed over 150 times in 47 productions spanning 5 continents. Hardly any new opera that I can think has enjoyed this much success so quickly. One reviewer stated, quote, "Dead Men Walking is opera's big move into the real world. It feels true because it is, for the most part, true. And while it points the way toward the future, it lies very much in the present. In that way, it offers an experience that is unlike most operas." The Houston Chronicle stated that, quote, Coincidentally, Heggie and McNally have written the most deeply and genuinely spiritual new work to inhabit either opera or theater stages in many years, end quote. Finally, a reviewer from the Tulsa World praises the work, saying, quote, "It is opera at its most accessible, with a story and characters that are instantly recognizable and understandable, caught up in events that are all too familiar, yet deal with the most fundamental issues, life, death, redemption," end quote. The Death of Klinghoffer was first proposed to John Adams before his most recent composition, Nixon in China, had premiered. He was approached by Peter Sellers to write another opera whose story was coming from recent events, the 1985 hijacking of the Achille Lauro. Members of the Palestinian Liberation Front hijacked the Achille Lauro, an Italian cruise liner, off the coast of Egypt on October 7, 1985. Although frightening, many people believed the negotiations to be peaceful, thus ending the nightmare. However, soon after the initial reports of a peaceful ending, the world was informed that Leon Klinghoffer, a 69-year-old disabled Jewish American, had been shot and dumped overboard by one of the hijackers. The idea was appealing to Adams, Sellers, and Goodman because it spoke to current issues and societal expectations were saturating the way typical Americans took in news and how they would respond to ideas put forth. This topic, regardless of the intention of the composer and librettist, was obviously going to receive resistance from the public and certain political figures, given the current events and views Americans were understood to have regarding the Middle East. Due to the difficult content this opera would be dealing with and the potential turmoil it could cause, Adams and Goodman found this opera more challenging than those of their past because they could not turn to, quote, the vernacular wit or dramatic irony that had given them so much pleasure in Nixon, end quote. They had many ideas and theories between the two of them on how to tackle this story, but after Goodman wrote the text for the first 2 choruses, it became clear that the story should be focused on the hijacking and the murder of Leon Klinghoffer. Once this decision was made, they used the book written by the captain of the Achille Lauro as the last piece of research that allowed Goodman to complete the libretto. Adams spent 2 years working on the opera, finally finishing in February of 1991. Since the work was part of a co-commission, it first premiered in Brussels on March 20th, 1991, and then moved to Lyon a month later and finally to Brooklyn in September. Although met with considerable acclaim in Europe, it was when the opera premiered in Brooklyn that the public reaction began to change. Since its various world premieres, especially the one in Brooklyn in 1991, the most persistent complaint against Klinghoffer is that it contains unforgivable representations of its Jewish characters, which in turn has led audience members to think that the team of Adams, Goodman, and Sellers were actually favoring the terrorist characters. Sellers and Adams actually stated early on that, quote, absolutely no sides were taken, end quote, and that the intention of the opera was to reach, quote, a human level beyond all political differences, end quote. This team of collaborators often has taken this path in their various works of being very unoperatic, in that they work almost too hard to portray the characters equally and never really land on any one side of the issue at hand. When taking the historical context of the Brooklyn premiere into account, it is not as surprising at the public reaction to the opera. Fink notes that just a month before the premiere took place, the most violent occurrence to date of Jewish black violence in American history occurred in New York City. From August 19th through the 21st, 1991, there were riots involving the killing of a Jewish rabbinical student, injuries to over 180 New Yorkers, and, quote, angry crowds of blacks broke Jewish windows, shouted Heil Hitler, and burned the Israeli flag, end quote. Needless to say, the Jewish community was not ready for any kind of negative commentary on their heritage or lifestyle. In reference to the treatment of the hijackers, we must first look to the music that their characters sing. In the opening chorus of exiled Palestinians, the text focuses on their great sense of less, painting a very descriptive picture that moves from raised houses to an angry mantra saying, "Our faith will take the stones he broke and break his teeth." The vocal lines and text of the four terrorists have been heavily criticized for being, quote, too seductive, essentially a humanizing musical language that romanticized or in some way justified their violence, end quote. Critic and scholar Richard Taruskin supports this argument as well, drawing between some of Adams' musical language and techniques found in Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Throughout the Passion, Bach would accompany the text sung by Jesus with a, quote, halo effect created by the upper violins and violas. Taruskin cites several moments in the score that supposedly include this type of orchestration, including the opening chorus of the Palestinians, and also the line, "We are not criminals and we are not vandals, but men of ideals," sung by the terrorist MUHL. He also notes that Adams chooses not to apply this effect to the character of Leon until after he is dead and we see his body being thrown overboard in the choreographed gymnopede entitled Aria of the Falling Body. In reading Fink's article, he spends many pages disputing the claims put forth by Taruskin. He cites two specific sections of the score that included probably the most effective use of Bachian effects. The first use of the halo effect with a dominant G pedal in the high strings toward the end of Marilyn Klinghoffer's lament at the very end of the opera. Another example comes towards the end of a heated exchange between Leon Klinghoffer and the hijacker named Rambo. Towards the end of the confrontation, Klinghoffer turns to comfort his wife, and the music settles into a combination of a C pedal, the halo effect in high strings, and a Baroque contrapuntal melody in the synthesizer. This moment, which takes place before Leon's death, actually appears to be the most effective use of the halo effect. So this would refute Taruskin's claim that, quote, only after death does the familiar American middle-class Jew join the glamorously exotic Palestinians in mythic timelessness, end quote. Now let's listen to the last portion of Marilyn Klinghoffer's final monologue. Listen for the halo in the upper strings. In terms of its libretto and dramatic pacing, Klinghoffer has been accused of being very slow and almost ritualistic in nature. Adams himself has drawn the similarities between his work and oratorios or the Passions of J.S. Bach. These claims are supported by the fact that the operas and the others by Adams have an overall lack of immediate drama and rely heavily on the role of the chorus. It is also difficult to see Klinghoffer as an operatic work due to its lack of decisiveness in its presentation of the storyline. Adams, Goodman, and Sellers have a tendency in all of their works to avoid painting any kind of black and white picture for the audience. Unlike most operas, where it is quite obvious who the villain is and what their punishment will be, Klinghoffer merely presents its title character as an anti-hero, ultimately making it even more non-operatic. Philip Kennicott proposes that Adams, in contrast to Verdi and Wagner, who stir up emotion in an audience, was trying to unstir us by giving humanity to all characters in the work. Sadly, because of these initial critiques of Klinghoffer and the ever-increasingly difficult relationship the United States has had with Middle Eastern culture of the past 2 decades, Klinghoffer is now often viewed in the context of whatever the most recent conflict involving terrorism, Jewish culture, or the Middle East may be. Taruskin was guilty of this kind of perception when he condemned the opera only 3 months after 9/11. Most recently, the Metropolitan Opera House canceled its 2014 live in HD transmission of the opera due to rising anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe. as cited by the Met's general manager Peter Gelb. Although those who protested the work felt vindicated, many national critics thought the Met's actions to be empty and irrational. After examining both of these operas in terms of their intentions, their scores and libretti, and their public reception, we can see that, despite the high level of craftsmanship involved in creating both, Dead Men Walking has found a stable and successful place in the operatic repertory, while The Death of Klinghoffer is likely doomed to be popular only because of the controversy surrounding it. Both teams were very intentional in their preparation process, both stating that these works were not concerned with the politics behind the dramatic situations, but more with the humanity of all the characters involved. Dead Men Walking's reception is greatly justified, based on the intentions of all involved in the creative process. After reading numerous reviews and interviews, it appears that these intentions can easily be felt during a performance of Dead Men Walking, whose characters are all presented as real human beings dealing with real-life issues. In contrast, The Death of Klinghoffer, although having similar intentions to the Dead Men Walking team, has received a very different reception. Therefore, I would like to put forth that, while I cannot say all criticisms of this work are without validity, the reasoning behind these critiques has less to do with the intention of the creators and more to do with the social lens of the time through which Klinghoffer has been presented. Nevertheless, we should count ourselves lucky to have two such works that have allowed for the treatment of serious current topics to appear on an operatic stage. Philip Kennicott put it best when he said, quote, "Art obviously isn't a magical elixir that solves the problem of politics, yet it seems everything else has failed. And if not art, then what?" End quote.